I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. What are we looking at today, Rob?
We're back in the 1980s. It's been a while, actually, since we talked about the 1980s.
Are we discussing Reaganomics today?
Yeah.
Actually, I'm not entirely sure that's not true. It totally could be true, because this story makes absolutely no sense.
See, I'm going to have to disagree with you. I think it makes sense well, it doesn't make sense if you're reading it from the expectation that all stories have to have this nice literary trajectory, or like linear trajectory.
It doesn't make sense if you expect a narrative to have a narrative. Yes,
now, see,
I agree with you.
If you expect a narrative to move from point A to point B and give you all the things you need to know in nice chronological order, no, it doesn't make any sense. But if you're going to say that, we have to discount a whole lot of amazing literature because it's not a quote-unquote proper story.
Let's have this discussion a little bit later. What story are we looking at today, Rob?
We're looking at, well, the English translation is pa, pa, pa with 3 Ps. The Chinese is actually ba, ba, ba.
So it's referring to like the kind of colloquial term for father,
right?
Papa,
right.
Or in Chinese just Baba.
So it was written in 1985 by Han Shaogong. There was a literary movement called the Roots-Seeking xungen school, Zhuyi. And the idea behind it was that the Cultural Revolution had turned all of Chinese culture into this huge mass with no distinguishing features, and that it had wiped out centuries, generations of vibrant local culture. So the xungen movement was determined to sort of recuperate that. It's also an interesting thing because it combines what sounds like kind of a conservative agenda, like let's bring back local culture, with really experimental avant-garde stuff. So in that sense, I think the best analog to think about is Faulkner. Faulkner used cubism, stream of consciousness, peculiar things like that to talk about the rural South, to highlight the culture there. So, there's something similar going on here. The story we're talking about is a pretty good example of that.
Yeah, we've also looked at one earlier example. That story was much shorter.
Yeah.
So that's Tan Shui's Hut on a Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And in this story, these are common things in the xungen movement, the root-seeking movement. The fact that they're concerned with local culture, I mean, this occurs in kind of a mythic time.
Yeah.
It
is very much like Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha, like it's just this place,
Yeah, that exists. It has a kind of region that we know about, but we really don't. It's a vague kind of location.
It's in the mountains.
Yeah, there are huts.
So there are references to Xinjiang. It doesn't take place near Xinjiang, but
it actually takes place in Hunan, which is where Han Shaogong is from. He is very much concerned about kind of reconstructing this unique Hunanese culture that comes, it has several thousand years going back to these associations.
And the only thing I know about Hunan is the food, which is amazing.
There was a very famous Chinese person who came from Hunan, if I
remember.
Who
would that be, Lee?
Mao
Zedong,
that's it. Yeah.
I think they just call him Mao now.
Yeah.
But
So Mao cut his teeth in doing Communist Party and labor work in Hunan. That's where we're going to. We're going back to the village. Now, if you were to summarize the plot, Rob, how would you summarize the plot?
Okay, I should preface that by saying it's a little bit like trying to summarize something like 100 Years of Solitude. Like you said earlier, it doesn't really have a linear story. It doesn't go from point A to point anything. It's just about this region, and it goes from narrative perspective to narrative perspective. It writes from the standpoint of this character, and then this character, and then this character, and they're all really weird. But it starts off with this kid who has a giant green head, like a gourd, that's too heavy for his body, and he runs in this weird crouch.
He can only say 2 things,
What are those things, Lee?
So he can only say Papa, or Baba in Chinese, and F Mama.
Yeah.
I looked back at the Chinese, and it's X. X. So that it just stands, X marks the spot. X stands in here for the F-bomb.
Because there's no way to really edit out part of a Chinese character like you would with the last 3 letters of the F word, And that's all he can ever say. That's where you start. And of course you think, well, that's weird. We're going to talk about this kid. Which he does for one section. Then the next section is a history of the village. And then the next section talks about a different character. And it really is like 100 Years of Solitude in that you get to see these same characters over and over again, but from different vantage points. And so if I were to summarize the whole thing, I would basically just say it's about this village on a mountain full of really peculiar and eccentric characters, all trying to sort of figure out how to continue being a village, how to make sure that the crops don't die, how to make sure there's enough kids born so generations continue, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, it sounds like a very standard sort of rural narrative. How do you survive in the modern world? But everyone is so weird.
There are some plot things going on, and there are sexual innuendos in this thing out the wazoo. But besides F Mama, the village is called Coxhead Village, and they have a war with Coxtail Village. And that becomes a thing. The village eventually migrates out and just leaves. So Coxhead Village disappears, and there are all of these questions. The young boy who can only say two things, he becomes an important part of that migration and the war. But you're right, there's not really any plot.
Yeah, it's very hard to summarize. But you know, it's funny because we talked about this right beforehand. I like stories like that. You were never a huge fan of magical realism, they call it, which is basically just Salman Rushdie, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who else? Gunter Grass, a couple others. These stories that are set in actual places in the real world, but fantastic things happen in those places. I love this sort of oddball, eccentric detail that gets thrown into there.
Can you give me a specific example from the story, a detail that you loved?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of them, but the one I can think of off the top of my head was it's in the fourth. It's not really a chapter. They're too short for it to be chapters. I guess a section. And
I can go with chapter because this is quite a long story.
I guess they are kind of long.
It's
more like a novella.
Short story, yeah, a novella. In Chinese, it was called a 中篇小说, so a mid kind of novel.
Yeah, not a full novel, but not a short story in the middle. It's kind of like a novella. Anyway, it's talking about the women of the village, how they like to meet up and gossip. So there's a couple of sentences. One says when they meet up and they're swapping news and gossip, they went on and on until a few kettles of tea had gone down their throats and the level of the urine bucket had risen a few inches until their faces grew pale and they broke out in goose flesh, which is such a weird detail. It's funny because it's weird, but it also kind of makes sense. I mean, you know, how would you tell how long people have been there? Well, if people have been peeing a lot, that would tell you that's been quite a while. But the other one, so the kid with the giant green head is called Young Bing, and his mother's a midwife. And in continuing the same section about the women, it says, and Young Bing's mother just returned from Coxtail Village on the other side of the mountain, where she had gone to deliver a baby, brought back the news that third grandpa of Coxtail had been bitten by a huge centipede at home and died. But no one learned about it until 2 days later, by which time one of his feet had been half eaten away by rats. All bad omens, it seemed. But later on, someone else said that third grandpa was still alive, for he was seen gathering bamboo shoots on the slopes a few days ago. And so third grandpa seemed there, and yet not there, his very existence open to question. And that's that sort of rapid-fire, almost machine gun detail, right? First you have Coxtail Village, you have a delivering of a baby, third grandpa, giant centipede, rats eating feet, like all in about in a tiny space.
And then it just asks the question, did he even exist?
Does this guy even exist? Is he dead? Is he not?
One of the things I did find interesting is the fact that this story is playing with does anything mean anything. It's playing with the sort of arbitrariness of the sign. So I'm thinking in a kind of Saussurean terms. What does it mean? This boy, he can only say two things, right. Papa and F Mama. And they try and interpret those things. At one point, Young Bing is kind of using those almost, or the villagers are taking orders from Young Bing in their battle against Coxtail Village. And every time he says Papa, someone will go, oh, well, that means that we should attack.
It's like, okay, this is the modern incarnation of this is Groot in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. You know, he says, I am Groot, and Rocket the Raccoon just translates for everybody, even though it's the exact same phrase over and over and over again. That's the way it kind of plays out in the story here.
But there are other things, you know, mothers and fathers aren't called mothers and fathers. They're called like older sisters or something. There's some weird kind of terminology going on. There's just all this stuff. If I could read some of the kind of sexual symbolism. So I'm looking at the end of chapter 2. 5 of the women who were married into the clan had to share one pestle room for grinding grain, and there was only one water bucket to be shared among 6 unmarried daughters. There's rapid fire kind of in-your-face sexual symbolism, and the story seems to be daring us to read it sexually, then also constantly asking the question, does this symbolism mean anything at all? Does anything mean anything at all?
Right, which I think is kind of fun, that sort of displaced, because this you can read it for, I wonder what this is really, referring to, but you can also just enjoy how weird it is, which I kind of do.
You are weird, so
I
it would make sense.
I am very weird. I also have much more refined literary taste than you do, so that's something to take
I wouldn't
into account.
disagree with you on that, because I wouldn't deign to disagree with you, because you're beneath me. So if it's okay, I want to turn to influences.
Oh, yeah.
So you were mentioning 100 Years of Solitude and Salman Rushdie. He may or may not be referencing those things. Those are kind of floating around. China in the 1980s, the listener needs to realize, is way more cosmopolitan than China is now. Because after the Maoist Cultural Revolution, a lot of the intellectuals were like, we want to just do foreign things, read foreign things. So you have poets like Heidze, who's knows Hegel backwards and forwards. He's referring to German romanticists. And so Han Shaogong may have very well been reading a lot of these 100 Years of Solitude.
It's almost sure he's been reading Faulkner. Faulkner was a huge, huge influence on writers in the 80s in China.
But we also have this interesting question about kind of the rural and that discourse of the rural. China has this long history of talking about rural communities and what they mean to identity. And I just want to point out, so this is towards the end of chapter 2, and there's a reference to Tao Qian or Tao Yuanming, who is, in sort of Chinese literature, he is the guy who starts the sort of rural tradition of writing in Chinese literature. He's the guy who goes back. We've done a podcast on him before. He goes back to the fields. He rejects kind of bureaucratic life and says, no, I'm just going to go back to my farm, hang out, be all kind of
Thoreau-y.
Thoreau-y, yes, thank you. He was doing Thoreau
way before Thoreau.
Like 1,400 years before Thoreau.
And that's an interesting reference, too, because Tao Yuanming is also the creator of the Peach Blossom Spring, the Peach Blossom Grove, this sort of, what is now the sort of Chinese utopian archetype, I guess.
Yeah, we did a podcast on that, too.
And this is very clearly, I don't know if it's referencing it directly, but it's a similar thing. You have this village, which for about the first half, all you read about is this village with vague references to anything else. So it's just seems to be set off all by itself in even a mystical way. It talks about it being above the clouds even. But there are also other references, because Chinese writers, especially in the modern era, like late 19th, early 20th centuries, really start to ask, okay, how do we put the countryside into literature? There's a lot of vernacular, weird stuff about the countryside, but how do we make it a part of sort of world literature? How do we bring it into discussion with Flaubert, with Tolstoy, with all of these people? That's kind of the project that Lu Xun and a lot of the May 4th writers are into. And back and forth in the 20th century, you have stories that are more or less straight-up documentary-style writings about the countryside. And then you have others that have a kind of a more ideological bent and are making it sound really weird. Like you can think even of Lu Xun's Diary of a Madman, which, whatever else it is, definitely doesn't depict Chinese village life in any sort of
it's not at all positive.
This is not Tao Yuanming we're writing about. This is not it running off to the beauty of the countryside. This is him depicting its darkness and its sort of backwardness. And what's funny about this story, Pa Pa Pa, is all of that is in play. You have, the village is by no means a utopia, but it's also sort of strangely fascinating. It's the kind of place you would want to visit, almost like you would want to visit a carnival. What is going on here? It isn't the kind of place you feel awful for these people. It's kind of funny in a way, which is something the Diary of a Madman never was. And yet it is also clearly struggling and suffering in a lot of ways, which is something that countryside never did in Tao Yuanming. So kind of all of that is sort of happening in this story.
One thing that's going on also at this point is writers are questioning what does it mean to be Chinese.
Yeah.
That's part of the xungen movement. You're going back to your roots. Han Shaogong is Hunanese, so he's going back to Hunan. But in the larger question, he's not leaving behind his Chineseness.
Right.
He was a sent down youth. He was one of the zhiqing, the youths who had to go to faraway villages.
During the Cultural Revolution. I'll clarify that real quick because the listener may not have it in their heads, but towards the end of the Cultural Revolution, actually it's about midway through, when Mao, I think, when the party at least realized that this was starting to get out of control with the Red Guards in the cities, decided to send them off to distant countryside areas to quote-unquote educate the people and to be educated in return. And what it actually did was just get rid of all the people running amok in the cities and send them, basically get them out of the way.
Right.
Of course, one of the many downsides of that, is that a lot of these people were sent out there, missed the formative years of their schooling and training, and came back with nothing, while the people that stayed in the cities were able, eventually after the Cultural Revolution, to return to all their business and education practices. And so a lot of the, quote, sent down to the countryside youth, came back with nada.
Right. And so he's dealing with that kind of rural heritage. That's an important part of his experience.
Yeah.
But he is kind of asking, with this story, I think, what does it mean to be me? What does my identity mean? By going back to Hunan, he's getting at his identity. And I think one of the things I hate about this story, the fact that it goes from point A to point question mark, I think that he's doing something with identity there too. He's asking, so it starts out appearing to focus on young Bing, but then it goes to this history of the village, and then it goes back and forth, and we come back to young Bing occasionally, and the title suggests that it is about young Bing. But we don't really know that. The story doesn't sit and just focus on him. And one of the questions I think is, does a nation have to have a single line that goes from point A to point B to point C to make it a nation? Or can a nation be something that's simply a bunch of different things and a bunch of different perspectives? Because one of the things about the Cultural Revolution is it only had one acceptable position of subjectivity. I don't want to be too technical, but essentially there was only one way to look at China.
You could only be Chinese in one way, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You were limited, very limited. And he's questioning that implicitly. He's saying, hey, maybe there are multiple ways to be a story.
Well, not even to expand on that, I think that's a good point, but it's not even many ways to be Chinese. It's many ways to be
me.
Just people in this village. There isn't even this sort of villageness. There's no Coxhead villageness. It's just everybody in the village is a little different, and sometimes they all come together to sacrifice something to the rice god or whatever. But everybody is so bizarre and eccentric that, and I think that's important. The eccentricity is important because you can't have any sort of uniform identity if everyone is so weird that there's no possible way for them all to come together and for this one thing.
It does seem to be advocating for a kind of individuality that was not allowed during the Cultural Revolution.
Which makes sense because, and I do really think this eccentricity and weirdness is a response to that, because a lot of the literature penned in the Maoist era, which ends in 1976, is really trying to cast all the Chinese characters and stories and poems as normal as you can possibly get. They wake up, they work hard, they're loyal to the party, they take care of each other. The most boring possible people imaginable.
We're going to look at some of this soon.
It's boring literature, but it's fascinating culturally.
As an artifact.
Yeah, it's a very interesting artifact. But this story would have been burned in the Maoist era because it basically casts a bedrock of Chinese communist culture, which is the countryside, the farmer, as the weirdest people you can possibly imagine.
Han Shaogong would have definitely been stoned to death.
Yeah, I think he would have.
Been,
This would not have survived. The only thing I can think of off the top of my head, and this is maybe a weird reference, is the movie MASH when it came out. Because up to that point, if you had a soldier in a movie, the soldier had to be brave, good, loyal, whatever. All of a sudden in this movie, you have soldiers as slackers, alcoholics, cheating on their wives and whatever, just being irreverent and ridiculous. which was funny, but also very much against type, and that this story is very much against
And
type.
there's an ideological element to that change of what the soldier can be in MASH.
Yeah.
And there's an ideological element to the change in what the countryside can be in this story, right? Like it's rejecting Maoist understandings.
Yeah.
As we're wrapping things up, I was wondering, so this village just completely disappears. And there's this question that the story asks, like, people will come by here and they'll see all these weird shapes after the village has been rotted and you can't really even tell it was a village. Will people be able to say there was this village here at one point? Or does it matter that this village is not here? Does it matter that this thing doesn't exist anymore? We had this history that we discussed in the second chapter, but does it really matter?
Because if it's not there anymore, who cares if it's not there anymore? Except that it's the subject of a story. Does that mean that being put into literature gives it meaning, gives it a purpose, sort of an identity? Or does it have to have something that is not related to literature at all and it exists independently?
Or does literature draw attention to the fact that nothing is inherently worthwhile?
Right.
That all things only get meaning by our attention to them.
Yeah.
And so if we just stop paying attention to them, then they don't have meaning.
And ultimately that could be the most powerful response to the Maoist era, which is even the bedrock, even the farm communities can and will disappear. Some of them without us even knowing.
And let me ask you something. Do you think this is a larger message about China after the Cultural Revolution, that it's this kind of pessimistic suggestion?
I don't know that I read it as pessimistic. It's because for me it's
really bad at the end.
It is bad, but it's also darkly humorous in a lot of places.
Sure.
This is something that I think is very characteristic of post-Cultural Revolution Chinese fiction. So much of it is really darkly funny. Anything for me that is darkly humorous, it's very hard to make it simply pessimistic, because humor for me is never, ever pessimistic.
You're way more optimistic than I am.
I don't know.
The reason I'm laughing is to keep from crying.
Could be.
That's what humor is for me.
I guess I would be careful to read this as some sort of reference to China in general, because the whole purpose of the story is eccentricity and not bringing everything together into one sort of uniform thing, which is what the Maoist era was. This is splintering everything into pieces. And so can we talk about China in general, or is it much more interesting to stop talking about China in general and start talking about the village? What about just the village in Hunan? You can almost hear him demanding this, right? Like, hey, stop talking about China for a second. What about just this one place? Can't we just talk about this one place? Is that not enough anymore?
But the fact that he grew up in this uber nationalistic period, I don't think we can ever abandon that nationalistic reading.
Insofar as he's responding to that in some way, yeah, that's totally true. I would sort of refrain from trying to see this as China, like this monolithic thing.
Sure.
Because this whole point is,
But I think the whole point of the novel is, does any of this mean anything? I think we can easily read it as both the local, we can read it as Hunan, we can read it as China at large, or it could just be some redneck village anywhere.
And my final word on this is that all of this is really interesting to think about, but ultimately, I just enjoyed reading the story. There's so many weird and sometimes hilarious details that it's just fascinating to see where it goes and how it gets there. I laughed quite a few times. For me, it's worth reading just for the experience of it.
The thing is, and this is my problem with it, it doesn't get anywhere. And if you enjoy that kind of thing, it's a great story, but yeah.
I enjoy the life and death of a really bizarre village story arc, and that's all it really is. But I love it. I love that sort of collage of detail.
Well, Rob, you're free to be wrong.
And Lee, you're free to have no taste in literature.
All right, I think we should end it there. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.